How many of you have ever been to an animal marine theme park and you watched an orca perform tricks for you? Well, did you know these animals are literally dying for our entertainment? I feel it's very important to inform all of you on the negatives captivity has on orcas. Orcas are one of my absolute favorite animals, and after watching the documentary Blackfish, I was inspired to do a bunch of research on the negatives captivity has on orcas. Shorter lifespan, collapse of the dorsal fin, poor living conditions, high stress, and health problems are just a few of the many negatives that captivity has on orcas. For starters, let's get into how orcas in captivity have a shorter lifespan compared to orcas in the wild. The average orca lifespan is between 30 to 50 years in the wild, whereas in captivity, their lifespan is averaged between 10 to 45 years. For example, in the article SeaWorld Breached by Benjamin Wallace, he states in 1961, at Marine Land of the Pacific, the first orca to be displayed in a marine mammal theme park died after only 2 days. At SeaWorld, Shamu had to be retired after biting a staffer riding on her back and not letting go until the trainers pried her jaws open with a metal bar. She died 4 months later, after only 6 years in captivity. This shows that orcas in captivity have a shorter lifespan compared to orcas in the wild. Not only that, but male orcas in the wild live a maximum of 50 to 60 years, while females live a maximum of 80 to 90 years. Unfortunately, this isn't the case with orcas held in captivity. For example, studies where they compared orca lifespans in the wild to orcas' lifespan in captivity were shown in the article published by the Animal Welfare Institute, stating that orcas in captivity had a mortality rate of 2.5 times higher than orcas in the wild. The difference was highly statistically significant. This also shows that orcas in captivity have a shorter lifespan. Now, let's get into how the poor living conditions orcas face in captivity and how this leads to the collapse of the dorsal fin. The living conditions orcas face in captivity are poor. This is because they are kept in cramped enclosures, which are completely different than their natural habitat. For example, in the article, The Detriments of Captive Citizens Research from Debating Science, it states aside from the small enclosures of captivity, including fatal stress related diseases in orcas, certain behaviors are exhibited in response to captivity that can also lead to a premature death. One example of stereotypical behavior affecting a captive orca's physical health is the orca whale's act of logging. This shows that the living conditions orcas face in captivity are poor and leads to other serious issues. Because the enclosures are so small, this leads to the orcas to swim in circles for hours and spend lots of times floating above the surface, which results in the dorsal fin to collapse because they're not spending enough time underneath the surface. For example, in the article The Incidence of Bent Dorsal Fins in Free-Ranging Cetacants from the Journal of Anatomy, it states frequent fin bending in captive orcas could be a result of gravity acting on the fins, composed mainly of fibrous connective tissues, insignificant movement that affects the tissue structure, or breakdown of the cartilage due to long exposure to warm air. This shows how living conditions in captivity are not suitable for orcas and leads to the collapse of the dorsal fins. Now that we've discussed the poor living conditions orcas face in captivity and how this leads to the collapse of the dorsal fin and other issues, let's talk about how this also contributes to high stress and health problems in orcas. Orcas in captivity are exposed to a bunch of stressors, which leads them to show extreme signs of chronic stress, such as self mutilation, listlessness, and agitation. For example, this was shown in the survey done by Claire Parker and Michael Romeo. In the article, Chronic Captive Stress in Wild Animals is Highly Species Specific, posted by Conservation Philosophy. The condition of captivity can be perceived as threatening and is the perceived threat does not decrease. Symptoms associated with chronic stress may result. The sources of stress in captive animals are mainly including cage restraint, human presence, an unfamiliar environment, and other more suitable stressors, such as artificial light conditions. This shows how orcas undergo high stress in captivity and how this leads to abnormal behaviors you wouldn't see orcas do in the wild. I'd also like to talk about how high stress and these poor living conditions lead to serious health problems such as tooth damage, infection, and pneumonia. For example, We were able to see this clearly in the documentary Blackfish when the trainers talked about all the health issues some of the orcas face in captivity, such as Shamu, who died from pneumonia, and Tilikum, who had struggled with serious tooth damage and health problems, all caused from captivity. Once again, this shows how orcas in captivity suffer serious health issues. Today, we discussed how orcas in captivity have a shorter lifespan compared to those in the wild, the poor living conditions orcas face in captivity, and how this leads to the collapse of the dorsal fin, along with other serious issues, and how captivity contributes to high stress and health problems in orcas. Shorter lifespan, collapse of the dorsal fin, poor living conditions, high stress, and health problems are just a few of the many negatives that captivity has on orcas. By going to these places like SeaWorld and other aquariums, you are supporting all these negatives. All in all, I'm glad I was able to inform all of you on the negatives because it is so important for us to be educated on how these orcas are being treated and cared for so we can do something to help rather than contribute to the problem. Thank you.